So welcome everybody to Creating the Future's board meeting for December of 2019. I don't know how that happened, but it got to be December already, but it did. I'm Hilda Gottlieb with Creating the Future, and I am excited about today's meeting. I know we're expecting one more person, and Mark will be here shortly. And so let's just sort of go around and tell us who you are, where you are, and what's exciting in your life these days. Angie, being as you started with it's cold, go.
Yes, it's exciting too that it's we have 40-mile-an-hour gusts of wind right now with snow blowing around. Hi, I'm Angie Eikenberry. I'm at Nebraska, and I'm in the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And let's see, I'm supposed to say something awesome that's going on.
Yeah.
Yes.
What's going on?
Well, what's awesome for me, especially, is as some of you might know, I'm president of ARNOVA, the Association for Research on Nonprofit Organizations and Voluntary Action, this year and next year. And we've been searching for an executive director, and we just hired someone, Lynette Cook, who she just started a couple weeks ago and sort of getting settled in. So it's really awesome that she is joining us, and awesome for the organization and awesome for me, because I've been trying to kind of carry a heavier load than normal. So it's great. Really happy that she's really fantastic, and maybe we can get her to join us for one of these upcoming meetings.
That would be wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And I'm glad you're here, Mark. Who wants to go next? I won't pick. You all just choose. Who wants to say hello? Tell us where you are located and what's exciting in your life these days.
I'll go next. I'm Joyce. I am calling in from Honolulu, Hawaii. It is enviable weather here. I have to admit, it's like high 70s, low 80s. So really enjoying that. I feel very lucky. The thing that is exciting for me right now is I have been in a headspace due to a workshop that I co-led 2 months ago. The workshop topic was around power and privilege in the nonprofit space here in Hawaii. And so I've been sitting and thinking about that a lot, and thinking about, as the new year approaches, how I'm going to be integrating that into the work that I do. My co-facilitator and I are exploring how we might continue the conversations that began at the workshop into the new year. So there's just a lot of stuff brewing around in my brain, and it's been a good mental space to be in.
Awesome. Well, when stuff is brewing around in your brain, I always want to know about it. So it's always interesting. It's always interesting. Who else? What's going on in your lives?
I'm happy to dive in. Maria Turnbull, day job as Associate Executive Director with Vantage Point in Vancouver, but right now I'm home on Bowen Island. And glad to be here working from home at least one day a week. What's exciting? The kids' soccer season is going to take a few weeks break, which feels exciting to take a load off. And so very much myself, my husband, and the kids looking forward to a few weeks where we have a little less commuting and lots of family time here, where my parents also live on the island. And work-wise, just kind of taking on and still doing lots of really interesting consulting projects up here with the range of nonprofits that we work with, and just huge variety at the moment. So I feel like I'm in learning mode a lot more than I sometimes am, because I'm doing governance stuff as we always do, but also stretching kind of in new directions.
Yeah. Now, when your kids have soccer, is that on the mainland? So you have to ferry in every day?
It's a mixture. They practice here on Bowen currently. They're young enough that we're still with the Bowen Island Football Club, but give them a couple of years and they'll probably have to even practice off island. So we'll brace ourselves for that new commuting reality.
Yeah, it is for those of you who have not been to Bowen, That's the price you pay for living in Bowen,
Yeah.
which is sort of like, feeling sorry for Joyce that the weather's so beautiful in Hawaii. It's like, yeah, okay. Wow. Awesome. Wonderful. Who else? What's going on in your lives? Go ahead, Vu.
Yeah, good morning. This is Vu. I am with RBC, an organization in Seattle that's focused on building leaders of color and helping organizations led by and serving communities of color. The exciting thing for me is this is my last week here as an executive director of RBC. Things are really great, but I'm leaving on a high, and I'm just hoping to make it through the next 5 days without some sort of crisis and just leave on a good sort of legacy here. And then I can watch Netflix for 3 or 4 months. So,
oh, yeah. It is going to be wonderful to see what you are up to next.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the fact that you're giving yourself that space to figure it out, that's pretty awesome. Pretty awesome. Yeah. Who else? What's going on in your world, Elizabeth or Mark?
We're fighting for it. Okay. Do you want to? I'll go, Elizabeth. So Mark Friesen, Director of Capacity Building, also at Vantage Point with my colleague Maria. Unlike Maria, I am here in the office today, so you can see my exciting cubicle and our terrific walls with some of our propaganda behind us related to nonprofit capacity building. Exciting in my life, I'm excited to report that I spent, not only did I spend a lot of time with my kids this weekend, but did so without having to do any crafts. I've got a 9 and a 5-year-old that are really into crafts, and crafts, like, if there's a hell, it'll be me doing crafts. So, but we got through the weekend with doing board games and hikes and everything but crafts. So that was pretty epic weekend in my world to be able to avoid that. And then excited this week. Some of you will appreciate this. We work with boards here at Vantage Point, but I'm also on 2 boards at the moment, and one of them, after probably 6 months of conversations, is going to adopt a report format at board meetings where people think about the questions that they're putting on the agenda in advance, like thinking ahead about what is a good question to, and it took a while for them to get that. So we're kicking that off this week for our board meeting. So I'm way too excited about that, way more excited than anybody else on the board. So that's it.
It's the life of a geek.
I know.
I know. Yeah. For the rest of you, Mark and Maria and I can geek out over board stuff at
way
like
too long.
That's it. Yeah. So we basically wait until the battery dies on somebody's laptop, and then yeah, that's how we know we're done. So Elizabeth, tell us where you are and what's going on in your world that's exciting.
I'm Elizabeth Sadlon. I'm an independent consultant based in Los Angeles, and I am in the spirit of celebrating longtime connections. Hildy and Dimitri and I have been compatriots for, I don't remember even how long, but a long and wonderful period of time. Excuse me. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to connect with a woman who was a client 15 years ago, and not only a client, one of those clients that I ended up learning tremendously from as well, that always happens. But in this case, it's the leader of Ruth Beahold, the Center for Nonviolent Education and Parenting. And 15 years ago, when I started working with her, my younger daughter was an infant and then toddler. And so not only were we stretching our thinking together about planning and organizational assessment, and she was also teaching me tremendously about parenting grounded in nonviolent communication. Yesterday, she happened to be at an event where my now 16-year-old daughter was leading as a volunteer some community-based activities. And it was just very gratifying for me to be able to see that continued connection, both with Ruth, and her daughter was there, and my daughter was there. And it was just wonderful to be able to see how the connections, like what Hildy and Dimitri and I have built over time, continue to really nourish me and stretch me. So I'm really excited to be together with all of you. And also, you don't know this, but we also have a long connection because I love following your writing and your speaking. So
Thank you.
Connected together today too.
Mr. Petropoulos, I'm going to turn off my sound so that you can. So Dimitri and I are sitting right next to each other. So if both of our sound is on, it goes. So I'm going to turn mine off.
Hello, everyone. Tucson, obviously. Even though it's raining, really the weather is very nice. So it's been wonderful. And actually, when we do get weather, i.e. rain or whatever, it's like everybody just runs around, just they're so excited. Oh my God, it's wet. It's, things are happening. And because usually it's not, it's that billboard from LA story. It's always the same weather all the time, that highway sign. A couple of awesomes, a personal and then two family awesomes. The personal awesome is about a week ago, I did the 50-mile part of the Tour de Tucson. So I rode my bike for 50 miles, kind of slow, but it was still fun. And Hildy kind of ran around and got to be my cheering squad. She would like be on a corner somewhere waving and taking a picture, and then she'd drive off somewhere else. And so that was all super awesome. It was really amazing. And then on Saturday, my brother, who lives in Sierra Vista, which is about an hour and a half or so away, who is a dermatologist, is basically shutting down his corporate practice. He will still practice, but his corporate practice. And so he held a party for his staff and invited us to come up to it. And the day was absolutely beautiful. It was outdoors. It was at a place called Tanca Verde Guest Ranch. If you've been out here, it's just a gorgeous place. And they just sort of shared their love for everybody. And it was just amazing to see what kind of a family he had created over the years. He and his wife, Wanda, where even some of the vendors who were there saying, I go to, I'm a vendor, selling medical supplies to practices. And he says, I can't even count on 2 fingers a practice like this that has this kind of basically integrity, love, whatever, for not only the patients, but the staff, and it's just really creates a family. So it was just delicious to be there and to spend, to be part of that and to share that. And the last thing is, I got a note from my youngest son that there was an IMDb posting of a movie he was in, hasn't come out yet, and it's the first, like, in theory, big movie. He doesn't have a gigantic part, but it's a speaking part. And so he was just, he's very circumspect. They could always cut me out. The movie hasn't come out yet and whatever. But it's just awesome to see what his agent had posted, his picture and everything else, and just saying, he's going to be in this upcoming movie this year. And so that was, so lots of family and personal awesomes this time to share. Oh, one last one. This meeting.
Yes, absolutely. And so one of the things that is going on here, which you all will notice, is the weather is changing so much outside that my skin color keeps changing. And I just keep looking and going, okay, now do I open the curtain? Did I change the lights? So if I suddenly start turning greener or start turning, it's like, I don't know, but it's been beautiful. Living in the desert, we live for rain. So, Vancouver and Seattle, you have your thing, and you live for sun, we live for rain. And it was thundering so loud and so long. It thundered for hours last night. And so it rattled the house. It was rattling the windows, rattling the house. It was so dramatic. So that is always cool, which means one of the nice things about living in a place where winters are temperate is that the winter garden is very happy. So all of the veggies are popping, and life is good in the garden. There's just lots and lots and lots of awesomes. Everything that's going on is exciting these days, and the garden is definitely a nice one. And today my daughter and I are celebrating her 34th birthday, because I was there. I was definitely there. So today is Lizzie's birthday. If you all have ever heard Patton Oswalt's bit about birthdays, if you haven't, Google Patton Oswalt birthday and listen to it on YouTube. It is a riot. And basically what he says is you only get a certain real number of birthdays. That, you know, until you're 10, you definitely get birthdays. And like when you turn 18, but if you turn like, you know, 17, nobody cares. That's not a birthday. That every decade you get a birthday. So you turn 20, you turn 21, you definitely get a birthday. You turn 30, you turn 40. And so Lizzie is not having a birthday today, but having a birthday. And we've been very clear about celebrating and not celebrating. So, but it's pretty awesome. And what I love doing on her birthday is posting to Instagram just about every hour another one of her baby pictures. So which is always fun because some of them I'm in and I'm a baby too. It's remarkable to look back 34 years and go, ooh, yeah. So and many thanks to Elizabeth, who has been one of Lizzie's very many moms over the course of her travels. So deep thanks to you. Oh, thank you, Maria, for finding it. Yes, awesome.
And I got to vote for what happens when you reach sort of the top age. That's
yes, it's very fun. It gets better and better from there. So to anybody who may be watching live or maybe watching afterwards, share with us who you are and what is awesome in your life. Just tweet to the hashtag creating the future, and we will be watching the Twitter stream. I did not get any indications from folks that they're going to be watching live. Frequently people tell me ahead of time, but one never knows. So you all are welcome. And as we're having our conversation, please jump in, join in, and just use the hashtag because that's what we'll be looking for. And today, normally we just sort of after our awesomes and catching up with each other, we generally dive into discussion, but we have a special fun thing to do today, which is that we as a board, I think we've voted 3 times since we've been in existence. We don't do a lot of voting, but one of the things that we do vote on because it's fun is to invite new board members. And so today we are going to be voting in Mr. Voulet to join us as a board member, and my heart just pitter-pats. I have loved every conversation you and I have had over the years. It is always delightful to find somebody who also wants to just, you'll pardon me, blow shit up and start over again. So it is an absolute joy to welcome you to the board move. And Angie and Dimitri, you and I are, you guys and I, Justin's not here and Carl's not here. We're going to carry the torch, and all in favor of inviting and accepting Vu into our family. Please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
So we're just happy to be here. And is there anything you want to jump in and say before we get started, Vu?
I want to say thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I always really appreciate your thinking and your pushing the sector, Hildy. And have been actually in the last few years, last year especially, been using a lot of what you and I have talked together regarding boards and, you know, how we have to move away from incrementalism. And yeah, so it's been really helpful. I'm looking forward to working with you to blow up more things here.
Excellent. Yes, and it definitely needs it. I've been having wonderful conversations with just individuals in key places throughout the sector, and it's time. Everybody's ready for it. It's pretty cool.
So Mark, if you would say what you posted, the only reason I'm asking you to do that is because in the recording, what's posted in the chat never shows up. So I just wanted you to share what you just shared with all of us.
Thanks for that, Dimitri. And no, just highlighting that really excited to see what's possible with VU connecting directly with creating the future in a very public way, being on the board, VU. Your work has been an inspiration to not only Vantage Point and the team here, but also many of the groups that we work with. So we've not often, connected directly with yourself, but the work in our community of not-for-profits in Vancouver and BC does resonate and percolate. I was really keen to see what's possible with you connected here.
And I wrote, "Thank you, Mark!" Exclamation point.
I love it. I love it. I love it. All right, we're going to get started. And I thought that it would help if I sort of laid the groundwork for anybody that may be watching. I know most people on the screen here have a really good sense of where we are, but anybody who may be watching or watching later. We have spent the past years, and probably have about that many years left as this continues to evolve, figuring out what the thing that was driving us was the question: if we did not have the organizational structures that we're all used to, what structure would we build to propel social missions forward? And it clearly wasn't the structure we're all used to. It found so many places where that structure actually thwarts change rather than propelling it forward. And once we started to look at the structure of the organization, you're obviously looking at, well, what does a board do within that structure? What we came up with for a structure overall is sort of a networked platform that supports people who are doing work that furthers our mission. It could be people who are teaching classes on behalf of creating the future, or it could be a group that's just doing a project out in the world that uses catalytic thinking and would be a great support for us to learn what they're learning. And do they need fiscal sponsorship? Do they, we're any supports that people need to do work that's actually furthering our mission, partnering and creating sort of this very loosely affiliated platform where folks could get what they need and support our mission at the same time. One of the big pieces in that was decision making, was the fact that the way decisions are made in the structure we're all used to separates so far from the decisions are separated so far from the people who are actually either doing the work or receiving the benefit of the work. The traditional structure says a board makes the decisions, or the board and the CEO make the decisions together, and then it sort of filters out. And that seemed to make no sense, where it continues to make no sense in the world. We've talked a lot over the past several years about the ridiculous notion that boards actually lead, that they're on the top of the org chart, but the foolery that CEOs actually supposedly lead, and then hand information to the board so they can pretend that they lead, and then it comes back down. And it just seemed, none of it made any sense. So the decision making will be made by people who are closest to the work, the people who it makes sense to have make decisions. And we know that if those decisions are guided by catalytic thinking, that they will reflect our values. So there's two big next steps. One is to actually build out the supports that will support that platform. That's for another day. And also the role of the board then. If the board's not either making decisions or pretending to make decisions, what does the board do? And we had a beautiful series of conversations this year. For anyone who's listening that is a board and governance geek, if you want to listen to our meetings as podcasts, just download them. All of them are available on our website. If you want to listen to our meetings this year, just in the car while you're thinking about stuff, this has been some of the richest discussions. What we started out with was modeling after a group in New Zealand called Enspiral, and they have gone to a structure where their decisions are made by the folks in their collaborative, and their board is focused entirely on compliance. And so we started out the year sort of deconstructing compliance, saying compliance doesn't feel right for us, because compliance is, okay, we tick off a box, we file our forms with the IRS, and who do you really have to comply with? And it's so punitive sounding, it's so reactive sounding, it just doesn't sound like us. And so we started to move from compliance to our board is going to be about meeting people's, who has expectations? Compliance is about expectations and commitments. To whom have we made commitments? Who has expectations of us? What would it look like if our board were about meeting those expectations? And what that eventually evolved into was this beautiful notion that the board is in charge of safeguarding the organization's integrity, making sure that we're meeting the commitments of whoever we have made commitments to, whether they're explicit or tacit. What does it mean to walk our talk? What does it mean to do our work in a way that is with integrity? And what that sort of looks like is asking people, what would you want to know in order to know we're walking our talk? So whether that's participants in our programs or people who are supporting us in any way, whoever is connected to us, we made a long list. What would you want to know that we're walking the talk of what we committed to you? And then figuring out what would it take to be able to show that. What questions would that board need to ask of whom? Not making the decisions, but just asking those questions, reporting back out, and then asking, are we reporting this in a way that makes sense to you? Because so often we report things, we say, oh yeah, look, we did it, but nobody reads it, nobody cares, it's not in a language that makes sense to people. And having that sort of be our loop, asking, searching, researching, answering. And that has felt really, really nice. That has felt really good. There was a beautiful moment at our May meeting when we figured this out, where you just watched everybody in the meeting go, oh. It just settled in. It just felt right. And so where we are right now, and I want to bring this up on the screen. Let me make sure I've got the right one. There we go. Using catalytic thinking in this process, every decision we have made about what the organization could look like structurally and what the board could look like structurally has been following the catalytic thinking framework. And that's why the question, when we look at whose lives will be affected by any actions we take, it was a really beautiful long list to say, who have we made commitments to? Who has expectations of us? Who are all of those people? Because so often organizations look at people who give them money and say we need to be accountable to them and to the IRS, and really don't think about anybody else. And then if they do think, they're thinking sort of nebulously about community, to the community, as if the community is like a thing, a monolithic thing. From there, we started to ask, what does good look like? If this board were accomplishing what it needs to accomplish, what are the conditions for success that we would need? That's how we came up with all of the focus on integrity. And what we're really looking at right now is we've got to build that board. We've got to build that thing. What will it take to build a board that is focused on integrity? What does that even look like? What does that mean? Let me see if this will allow me to do. Now, can you all see on the screen that I changed, or do I need to? Okay, it's showing, good. Yes. During our last meeting, we started to ask questions about conditions for success for this board. So if the board is going to be focused on integrity, what do they need to know? What do they need to have? And it was everything from board members needing to know, how do we define what's in the best interest of the organization? And what does it mean, just in that very, very simple thing, that basic legal thing, to be a fiduciary? What does that mean? What is the English version of that? What does it mean a board is doing? The board needs to know who has the information that they're looking for. Who has, how do we make sure that folks are walking that talk with integrity? What does that look like? And needing to know whether catalytic thinking was used to make a decision, and et cetera, and et cetera. We also looked at what that board would need to have. There'd need to be conduits and connections to the stakeholders that will be asking those questions and about their expectations. Clearly, board members will need to work and play well with others. This is going to be a team, especially in the beginning, that's going to be building this. But we talked so much over the past several years about what it means to share power. Who has power? There was a beautiful reflection at the end of the meeting, and I'm going to actually read it. Carl's reflection at the end of the meeting. He brought up, Carl is a board member who is in the UK, and he brought up this quote by Tony Penn, who is a former MP in the UK. And here's the 5 questions that Tony Ben was asking. I'm sorry. What power have you got? Who gave it to you? In whose interests do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how can we get rid of you? Which I love. And so a lot of really good conversation about board members will need to have comfort with sharing power, which is a very different concept than what we've seen in the past. And one that has been sticking with me operationally quite a lot is that board members need to have mechanisms and protocols for how they will invite inquiry, find the answers, deliver those responses. So there's a lot there. There's a lot there. And so what we really are going to be focusing on today is continuing that conversation about what is it going to take to build this board? What is it going to take to build it with intention, with integrity? And if we're talking about sharing power, what does it mean for us not to presume things, to actually let the board decide what it's going to do? I'm not making any assumptions. None of us have been making any assumptions all along about who's going to be on this board. Who are the right personality fits to be on the board? Who makes sense to be on the board? So for those of us now building it, you know, we may stick around, we may not stick around. It may be a totally different group of people. What does that group of people need to have? What do they need to know? Before we move on, I'd just like to sort of do a check-in with you all in terms of just a bit of reflection. What is all of this bringing up for you, and how are you feeling about it? And as we dive into the discussion, what's sparking for you? If you had a chance to look at those lists, what's resonating for you?
Ivan, for me, it feels there's a hint of overwhelming in that and Mark's been on about this for a long time. Kind of, you know, we've been in the business of supporting boards to make sense of their role. We have a lot built into that kind of those educational materials. You know, a massive team of people might not know Vantage Point's kind of delivery model. We have a number of staff people. We're about 14 total staff members currently, of which, let's say, 5 are out delivering sessions with nonprofits around the province. But then about, I don't know, 70 volunteers that work with us as skilled professionals, many of whom are facilitating board and governance kind of work. And so thinking how we kind of what it makes possible. I mean, we've got a massive, you know, we've got a large team in relation, and we're working with an awful lot of nonprofits. And so pretty exciting to imagine what a completely revised approach to conceptualizing the board, what that might make possible for all of those organizations. Yeah, it's sort of a little bit of hesitated excitement for where these conversations might go. And yeah, but good.
Okay. Anybody else got something sparking for them?
Well, I'll segue from Maria, just to be really, what Maria's maybe alluding to, or something that you just piqued for me, Maria, is we do a lot of work with nonprofits and around governance and giving the boards clarity. But the increasing reflection I have, and I shared this with maybe you, Hildy, or someone at some point, the boards that seem to be functioning the most well and doing governance the best are the ones that are breaking the rules. They're the ones breaking the rules about what you're supposed to do, about what vantage point, like they're doing something that's not correct if you Google like nonprofit governance. This framework and this approach is, to me, kind of making it okay to do that, right? So if we can give confidence to groups to say, no, you know what, that other stuff where you are just everything you described, Hildy, that's, you know, we're finding that that's off the mark. But what is that? What does that look like? I think that could be really powerful. And just keen to see this conversation go into the, you know, what's necessary to equip a board to go in this direction. A conversation with, you know, another group who are frustrated at using Robert's Rules of Order. Well, their comment was, well, the challenge is we want to get rid of, you know, we don't want to feel that Robert's Rules of Order are conducive to generative dialogue or deliberation or healthy deliberation or all the rest of it. But what do we replace it with? And we need something clear that we can replace it with. And there's some stuff out there. So if this can allude to or give some, you know, tangible tools about, okay, we don't just mean a free-for-all, but there can be a defined process to share power and share decision making, then that could go so far to, you know, give groups confidence to do things in a weird way, but also in a way that I guess is effective.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's so fun for us living in that gray zone. I know that I personally, Dimitri will tell you this, I have a very, very high tolerance for uncertainty. And so that's the, you know, it's both uncomfortable to live with, and as he will tell you, but it also, for me, the gray zone is where the fun is. That's where the possibility is. And to say, I have no idea what it's going to look like, no idea how it's going to function, I have no idea if it's going to work, but living inside that experiment and knowing what the end goal is and constantly adjusting so that you're constantly keeping your eye on that end goal, it's very, very cool.
The thing that I like about this thinking is that the fact that it's so generative, so that there is, you know, Mark, you sort of keep my thinking here as, what is it replaced with? It's replaced with something that's very generative. So it isn't a specific thing. It's a series of questions, whatever, so that you could have 10 different boards with 10 different structures, yet they're all accomplishing what they need to accomplish for their mission, or, you know, whatever. But that to me is really, really interesting. The metaphor that I frequently think about is a caterpillar to a butterfly. They both have structure, and yet they're very, very different. And they go through a transmorph process for one to become the other, but they're not disconnected from each other. It is a connected process, yet they're unrecognizable to each other. They wouldn't even know that they were the same thing. So those are the kind of sort of reflections that, when I think about this, come to my mind are those two things. One, it's generative, so that I have no idea what it's going to be for you or the 10 organizations you might have on your plate right now. Each one may be different. And the fact that it will have structure, whatever that means, right, when you come out the other side of this.
I really like that metaphor, Dimitri, of the caterpillar and the butterfly. I think the transformation, though, is very challenging for people and very, very painful to the caterpillar. And the entire sector is full of caterpillars who know that they need to transform, but they hate it, and they don't know, and they can't live with uncertainty. I mean, we've been trying it at RBC, right? We've been trying just to blow up every single thing here. And the staff are completely on board, and we've had some challenges. One of the things I brought up to the board was like, we're challenging every single thing. And now it's time for us to think about the board. And so we hired a grad school student to start looking at different models. And one of which was Creating the Future's work. But there was still a lot of resistance, and it really showed through my transition out of here as the ED, right? Where the board is like, yeah, we love what you're doing, staff, you're really amazing. And now this is our job to hire the ED. And the staff are like, we're trying to do things differently. Why can't we work together to hire the ED? And we need to re-examine the entire notion of leadership and who's an ED. Do we even need an ED? Do we need 3 EDs or 2 or whatever? And the board's like freaking out because they're like, oh my God, we can't do this. And we have to slow down and do the whole thing, because even though they say that they want this metamorphosis, they are not ready, and no one has told them. So there's a whole lot of unlearning we have to do, and a whole bunch of unconscious issues and challenges. So I think that's something that we have to start thinking about, is not just the technical aspect of this new structure, but all these adaptive challenges and the fears that people have. They don't even realize that they have them.
Yeah, you're reminding me, Vu, of a conversation. It was a foundation board. Some of you have heard me I tell this story a lot. It lives in my brain. It was a foundation board where very innovative foundation. The CEO was brilliantly innovative, and he loved blowing stuff up, loved making no assumptions. His board, this was a hospital conversion foundation, a healthcare conversion foundation. And for folks who are not in the US, because we have private healthcare, when a nonprofit hospital sells to a private entity, the assets that are left become a foundation. So if they sell for, $70 million, I'm making up a number. Where does that 70 million go? It doesn't go to the board members of the nonprofit. It goes into the corpus of a foundation. And that is called a health conversion foundation. And unfortunately, it's a big enough thing because so many nonprofits sell to for-profits that it is a thing. And the original board of this organization, Vu, was the hospital board. So you've got this very staid, this is how we do things. And they've got this CEO who's like, yeah, we can do whatever we want. Let's blow stuff up. And at one point he wanted to do deep community engagement and find out from the community, what do they think they need? And one of the board members, honest to Pete, said the following: what if we ask them what they need and they're wrong? I got nothing. I got nothing. So yeah, and so much of that is the sharing power thing. Anybody else have any reflections, anything that's sparking for you before we dive in and start talking about, all right, what is it going to take?
I just have one comment that was sparked by the other comments. Just that I really appreciate that metamorphosis kind of language versus the blowing it up. Mark often talks about blowing stuff. Look at him, he's offended.
You and me, kid.
Because I think that the language is less jarring, something about it, and as well I think the honoring of that which is sound and beautiful and awesome about wherever we happen to be right now. Because caterpillars are darn cute, and I'm sure there's some that are darn poisonous, but I like that it connects with that which we are now, and yet grows and develops and looks forward to a slightly more beautiful future. So appreciating that from this call.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, and one of the things that we also acknowledge is that because it's really nobody's job in the sector to experiment, to play with stuff. I mean, it's a food bank's job not to figure out what governance should look like. It's their job to make sure people have food and that they're healthy. And so we know that we're out on the edge, and that that balance between what do we keep, what do we throw out, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what feels right, and why does it feel right? To whom does it feel right? If it feels right to board members who have been board members at everything in their community for the past 40 years, but doesn't feel right to people in the community, those kinds of big questions are going to be jarring. And I do love the thought, Mark and Dimitri, that this could look completely different for any other organization, depending on, but if the questions are there, what do we want to be and for whom? What would good look like? What does having a board make possible? Who gets to make decisions? Ask those 5 questions that Carl came up with, and how do we get rid of you? But starting to ask those questions of who gets to make decisions, slowly having those conversations. It's really easy to look at where we are right now, creating the future, and say, yeah, this makes perfect sense. But Angie, you were part of the conversations when this conversation started. We didn't start with that. We started with recruitment.
Yeah.
We started by asking, we need new board members.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so amazing. This makes me think of a conversation I had a couple weeks ago with one of my colleagues in another board of an organization that, she's an officer on that board, and I approached her about, that could we talk about how our organizations might collaborate more? We have similar missions, similar overlapping memberships, and really, I was shocked when her response was, well, wouldn't that be a conflict of interest? How can we even have that kind of conversation? And I realized, like, I've moved so far in a different direction from a lot of my colleagues, but still, I still have a lot to learn, and it's growing, but it's really like, so I guess back to, the point that Maria and Mark made too, like, some of the stuff is so ingrained, like different framing going on, that that's, I don't know, I guess it's scary for others people, and even as Vu, you had said, like a lot of organizations wanting to make this change, but I think in reality there are also a lot of organizations that maybe it's just not even on the radar, like they're anyway, and I also wanted to just say, like, I'm glad, Mark, that you brought up moving beyond Robert's Rules of Order, because I think too, a lot of times, even if we want to change, we don't have the tools, or we don't know what the tools to use, and those are going to be so important to this. I've been experimenting with Martha's Rules of Order, which is still not ideal, but
Wow. Well, let's dive in right there. The what do we need to have? We can't just flip the switch. This is so radically different than what's in place. And in thinking about what we do want, the cycle of asking and finding the answers, reporting out those answers, asking, is this okay? Each of those has pieces that we don't know what it is. I mean, we acknowledged last time, we don't even know who to ask, okay? So it's easy enough to say participants in our programs, they're actually already participating in a program we have. But for others, people who are, I can't tell you the number of times I'll do a speaking gig, somebody will come up to me after, it happened in Italy, and this person wasn't even from Italy, they were from someplace else in the world, I don't remember, came up to me and said, I have been following your work for years. So how does one get in contact with those people that we don't even know? I mean, so at each point, there are so many questions of what are the mechanisms and structures and protocols that need to be in place. What are some of the, let's talk about the, let's pick a place on that cycle. If we are, I don't know, does one of those places on the cycle interest you all more than others, or seem like an easier one to, I'm sort of playing with internally where we get answers from. How does a board, so if somebody says, yeah, I want to know if y'all are walking the talk of what I think is important in these programs, what would the board need to know? What would they need to have? What kind of mechanisms? What kind of protocols? What are the things that would need to be in place for that?
I'm just thinking about rituals and questions around in thinking about that. I'm thinking back to this immediate previous conversation.
I'm going to switch over, honey.
All right. I'm thinking about the immediate previous conversation that we just had about this morph versus blow up versus whatever, and how boards can be completely different. And I love analogies. So the analogy that went through my head was, okay, my question is, or my ritual is, I wear clothes. Okay, am I in Hawaii or am I in Alaska? The clothes I wear are going to be very, very different. Yet they're still clothes. So, as opposed to saying everyone must wear a parka, no matter where they are, because they are a person, and that's what clothes is defined as. And so, to me, a lot of it revolves around, are we asking the questions to be able to answer somebody else's questions? I mean, have we answered the questions for ourselves as a board? Have we defined the questions? Have we answered the questions? And can we then use those as a yardstick or as a way of measurement or as a way of answering other people who may have a question around that? Yes, this is the question we asked. These are the things we thought were important, which we've already defined to a great degree. And so that's how I'm thinking of it.
I'm thinking about maybe an underlying assumption of willingness that people. I'm going to that story that you told, Hildy, about the board member who was just really honest about saying, what if they're wrong? What if we don't agree? And so to be willing for a board to, and this is one of those hard transformations, is to in that preparation for sharing power, is to recognize that they're willing to hear the answers and what they're willing and committing to do with what they hear and learn. And so if we're breaking down the decision-making roles and process, what then resides with the board when they hear this input and getting agreement on that? Because nothing worse than asking and not doing anything with. Yeah, but there's lots of layers of things that could be damaging about that. So that might be one of the preconditions, is being clear about what we're doing with it.
Well, it raises the whole other question, which is, if we've said that decision-making will happen where the work is happening, and that the board will not be making decisions, what happens if they find stuff that's seriously out of alignment? Which is a whole nother question.
That's a decision. To say that we're not making that decision is a decision, and that is power too.
Right, and the so far, the structure as it's been envisioned so far, I can't, I have no idea what it's going to be tomorrow. Is that that the decisions will be made by the people who are the closest to the decision. But what does that mean, for instance, if, and I know we're going to the what if things screw up place. And I guess the answer is they'll use catalytic thinking and they'll figure it out. Yeah, which just answered the question. But it is a working with, which is again the sharing power. It is, if the board is about, you're watching my brain just go. If any of you watch the Joyce, do you have any reflections before you go?
My brain actually is stuck a little bit in sort of like the previous conversation, but I think it ties in. Something that I was thinking about is this whole idea of people having fear and getting stuck. And I've been reading this book about habit and habit formation and creating new habits. And one of the figures the book throws out is that 43% of what people do is not, they're not consciously doing it. It's just sort of rote, right? And so, you know, in thinking about both for board members, a lot of what they're doing is out of habit, and that includes the way that they run their organizations or the way that they lead. But I think it also happens in the way that community has their habits about what they look for, what they are asking from board members, because they have been conditioned to be thinking of leadership or board leadership in particular to look a particular way. And I think, you know, in thinking about these questions, one of the things I realize I myself am struggling with is I have those same habits ingrained. Like the things that I keep going to, the models that I keep looking to in my brain for the questions to pose or the things to be testing are things that are already established. And so part of this whole, you know, metamorphosis versus blowing things up is to me about how do you fill the void of something that is not yet described? Where do you fill in that space? How do you even create the language to fill that gap in? Yeah, I don't have anything fully formed yet, but I can feel this is the thing that I'm struggling with, is not even feeling like I have the language to pose something to put into that space.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the things that has been, and again, I keep using the word exciting, but to me it is exciting because it is the question of, okay, we know that this doesn't work, but it's the only thing we've got and we're used to it. What do we put in its place? And one of the things that we're doing concurrently with this work is also working on communication strategy, which is going to be about really sharing what are the questions that we're asking, and being very intentional and very mindful to say, we're not saying it's the thinking that's replicable. The doing is never replicable. The doing is Dimitri's example of putting the parka on and you're in the tropics. But if the questions can be, okay, if you're uncomfortable, if things aren't working, here's questions that can guide you. Here's a framework of questions that can guide you so that you'll figure it out how it works for your organization. I think that's going to be the most powerful thing that can come out of this. And yeah, if we can serve as an example of here's a way and it worked for them, but that may be completely different for you. But it's again, they need at least questions to ask. They need at least something because that gap is, you know, all right, yeah, this isn't working, but we'll do it because it's there.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. I hope your family's good and have a wonderful holiday, and I look forward to seeing you in the new year.
Thank you, same. Thank you, everyone.
So glad you were here, Joyce.
Hi, Jerry.
And I know Maria will be right back. She had a thing she needed to jump off to do.
I think having I want to caution us against overthinking things, because this is something that happens a lot in our sector. We just love intellectualizing about every single thing. And we need to be pushing, like, look, it's not working. Don't keep doing it. That's the definition of insanity. Like, try something else. And so that's one thing, is just really encouraging people to just go ahead and try stuff. And I think what has stuck with me after many of our conversations really is this concept of the minimally viable board, which makes me think, like, what is the very basic minimum stuff? Because if we don't have these like minimum conditions down for people to understand, you know, it's kind of like the Carver model, right? Everyone is always asking for permission. And people are like, can I do this? Can I give my staff a week off? When the corporate model is like, you need to set parameters of what you cannot do, right? And then everything else the staff should be able to do without asking for any permission at all. There's only like 3 things that staff should be able to do. And being able to switch that around, I think has been very helpful. So I think it's the same, but we got to do it on this meta level of like, what are the 3 things that boards absolutely cannot do? Because right now, people are so fearful that they're like, well, we have to do Robert's Rule because that's the legal thing that we have to do. And I'm like, no, it is completely inaccurate. That's just a tradition that's passed down. And so I think being able to address the fears in the sector, right, is one thing. And then just maybe having some sort of matrix, like these are like the 7 key components that we need to think about, right? Here's the decision making. Here's the fiscal responsibility. Here's the hiring of the ED and who should be doing this. What's the minimal requirement for hiring the ED? You legally have to sign their offer letter or whatever, but otherwise, you know, you don't really need to supervise them. These are all things that are negotiable. So I think us being able to identify these elements, these critical elements, just like when we're going through Dimitri's analogy, it's like, if you're gonna talk about clothing, you have these 7 elements: temperature, aesthetics, breathability. I bought a jacket. I spent a lot of time researching jackets here. So there's like these, and they are very sophisticated. It's like, we're gonna review this jacket, and here are these key elements: warmth, breathability, waterproofness. So as long as we can identify those elements down, I think we can have an actual matrix of here's where you are at, the traditional model, and here's a catalytic, whatever, the integrity board model.
Yeah, and again, we don't have to fix this for everybody. We're really building what's going to work for creating the future. And then if that's a model that others want to adopt, great. If it's not, great. But the most important thing is that it worked for what we're creating. And if others want to play with it, awesome. And I do encourage, I love the if it's not working, you know, what in everybody else's world, what will encourage them to try stuff? One of the things, just as a point of information, we spent, Justin and I, as the chair of the board, Justin and I spent a good chunk of last year talking to compliance people and attorneys about what boards are legally required to do. And what we came up with is that there are 2 things boards are legally required to do. 1, they are legally required to exist. So you must have a board. In many states like Arizona, where we're incorporated, you need 1 board member. So you legally, the IRS may want to see 3. Okay, you need to have a board and you need to not mess up. And those are the only 2 legal requirements. And in talking to Mark and Maria, it's not a whole lot different in Canada. That's it. And so all the rest of it is just BS that we've layered and layered and layered on top of it with lots and lots of shoulds. And so the stripping down to what we legally need, yeah, we could do that by 3 people meeting in a room once a year saying, yep, we're good to go, and not messing up. So the beauty of what does it take to be in conversation with the people who have expectations of us? Who guarantees that we're meeting those expectations? Who even knows? Do we even know what their expectations are? How do we know if we're meeting them?
If I could jump in there, Hildy?
Yeah.
Just I really like who's challenged us not to get too stuck in our own heads and coming up with tangible things. And the challenge that I'm kind of taking away is like, what's that list of things or areas where groups could just make their own rules? Just to directly dispel those myths, just to say these things, these assumptions you have, or these, these assumptions you have about how to make decisions and who to be included, they're just assumptions. And actually you can make up your own rules in this area. Half our work ends up just dispelling myths around, no, like Vu was just saying, you don't have to use Robert's rules. You don't have to, like, that's just a made up thing. Like, no, or it's a convention that we've ended up following and nobody's questioned it. It's simple and easy to understand. Somebody follows it. and we're just kind of locked into that. So could we just have a list of things or areas that nonprofits, based on your legal research, that articulate to say to groups and give them confidence to say, here are all the areas where you can make up your own rules, where you don't have to follow up some other kind of convention. Just these are the areas where you can do things of your own accord. The other thought I had, and this was getting back to Joyce's comment about her challenge, I guess, around the rote vocabulary to kind of articulate the way she was expressing that. And then Dimitri, your notion of we're still wearing clothes, even though we're different environments, but they kind of look different. One tangible tool that's equipped or has come up sometimes in questions in our work with boards is unpacking what is a decision, or what are the steps in decision making. So Hildy, when you say, okay, final decision making will not be with the board, I think it might be valuable to go a little bit deeper than that. To say, well, what would it mean, or what parts of a final decision? Because a decision, you can break it into different parts, and in encouraging groups to share decision making, sometimes it's been valuable for us to break it down. An example I'll often use, say if we don't do that, if we don't break down decision making to what are the different parts, then we start making some bad assumptions. And the example I'll always use is a ministry here and putting through a new highway and a bridge said, oh no, we delegated final decision making around the bridge and the overpass. We empowered the community with final decision-making power. The way they did that was a referendum to ask residents in the area what color the retaining wall should be. So sure, there's an argument to be made. Yes, they delegated decision-making. They included a lot of people. A lot of people filled out the referendum indicating what color, their preference for a color for the retaining wall, but they didn't, that's not the way they wanted to be involved in a decision. So that experience, I use that as a scenario to say, okay, you've got a decision, there's a couple parts. There's framing or setting the agenda, right? It's where at the start of meetings, we ask, okay, does everyone have the, does anybody have any to answer? What are the questions, right? That's like framing the agenda, framing the issue. Then there's research gathering, then there's shaping the options. So option A, do we want a bridge or not? I mean, and this scenario just described is way like past all of that, right? So we could say, in looking at the circle that you've got for each one of those, and it's not going to be the same every time, to say if the board is looking to share decision-making, well, what part of decision-making? Are they looking to only, do all those precursor steps and then share the final decision? Or do they want to retain? So sometimes city councils or municipal governments get in this, the way they approach it is say, well, no, legally we have to make the final decision because we've been voted in and we're in for office. But where we could get people involved in decision-making is the earlier stuff around the framing, telling us what questions to ask, telling us what information to get. And then, yeah, let's be honest. We're going to go into council chambers and we're legally required to make the vote on this, right? So if we could say, okay, final decision, but what are the different component parts of a decision? And then going through your circle for each of those to say, okay, how are those going to be split up? And going right back to Vu's thing, like reminding groups explicitly, don't assume you have to behave a certain, you can make up your own rules. There's no rules about who and how you have to include. It's really up to you to strip apart a decision into the different component parts, framing it, getting information, shaping proposals and counter proposals, and then last is the final decision, approval or support or whatever, right? And then to say, okay, who are we sharing these different parts with, and how are they involved in each of those steps?
So if we're not looking at for other groups and we're looking specifically at creating the future.
Right.
Because I love the question. Unpacking what are the steps of the decision. What would need to be in place for the board if they are basically the conduit between the people who have expectations of us and the people who are doing the stuff? I'm a donor, and one of the things, or I'm a supporter in some way. I'm a community member in one of the online communities that helps run the community, and I want to know about all of the other decisions that are being made by all of the other online communities, and I expect them to be operating from a place of integrity, because I know in our community we're operating from a place of integrity. And so I'm a person who has an expectation of the organization, and I want to know, creating the future, how are you making sure that they're running with the same integrity that our online community is running? Okay, now I have a specific example. I want to make sure, I know that, for instance, we've got a consultants community on Facebook. that has been together for 5, 7, 8 years, that has rhythms and deeply embedded values of how they function, which is very different than some of our other communities. But I'm a member of that community and I love this community. If I step into all those other communities, how will I know that they feel the same as this one does? So what as a board member am I doing? Wow, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Okay, so where am I going?
Well, I don't know how much, I'm a new board member. So I think it'll be helpful for us to really talk about the values and the guiding, values that we have and how is that operationalized, right? We've been doing a lot of that work here and it's been really helpful because we did have many of these conversations when donors come in, like, especially around racial dynamics. When we had white donors come in and say, well, I don't feel, whenever I raise my hand, I don't get called on. And we're like, okay, we need to talk about this. Why is it, what's going on? And it turns out that a lot of staff are like, well, we want to call on people of color first. And as soon as we institutionalize that in a value, it's like, look, if you're going to be involved, this is a POC-led organization, you may not get called on. Are you going to be okay with that? And as long as it's spelled out and it's very clear, then it's been really helpful. Just for our own sake, I do think that it might be good for us to spend some time just really unpacking some of these, like the things that we need to unlearn. Because I feel like there's still a lot of unconscious stuff that we ourselves have to deal with. And an example of this is like our RBC. Again, we are a capacity building organization who is trying to push capacity building along in different ways. One of those things is really experimenting with this decision-making model at RBC, the advice process, where I, as the ED, actually don't make many of them. In fact, almost none of the decisions do I make or have any veto power over. It's like if you are the program director, you're in charge of the programs, you have to do your due diligence and seek out, input from people who will be most effective, et cetera. At the end of it, you make the decision. I, your boss, cannot veto you. And we thought, this is great. Everyone's gonna, and people did love this in the very beginning because this, we're like, this is like, we all came together because we want to move things along, to blow things up, to whatever, transform, etc. But then as we went along and started implementing things, what we realized is that we had all sorts of stuff. A lot of staff were resistant to making decisions. They had fears around the autonomy they were given. And some of them were starting to blame senior leadership, like why you are basically abdicating from your responsibility of making decisions. And you are not doing your job. Stop being so damn lazy, Vu, and like make these major decisions, right? And so and that went on for a long time until we actually sat down and said, can we actually talk about what is going on? And spent like 2 hours talking about people's unconscious and conscious fears. And a lot of all POCs, a lot of women of color were like, well, we have like this double jeopardy of being women and also being people of color, which means that if we make a big decision and we fail, then it's going to reflect on us, it's going to jeopardize our career, it's going to reflect on every other woman of color who will ever be hired from now on. The men of color had issues because they were also trying to deal with, like masculinity and not being seen like they are too pushy with the decisions. They had some challenges regarding if you ask for feedback as part of the advice process, but someone else disagrees with you, and yet you have to make a decision, then what happens if you make a decision that goes against what people give you feedback for? Then it's going to jeopardize the relationship with this person who gave you this feedback. So there's all of these challenges that we had to really untangle. After that conversation, it was very helpful just to kind of have that all out in the open. So I would encourage us to really start thinking about, okay, if we're going to be doing this, we need to like ground this in our values. And maybe talk about what are some of the things that we need to start unlearning and some of the unconscious fears that we have.
And I feel like if we did that, Hildy, that would get back to your question around what would, somebody participating in an online community, because they could look to what another community and they would know, they would say, okay, so say there was a decision that decision-making, creating the future board followed an advice giving process, like what Vu just articulated. So even though I'm in one online consultant community, I would know that, well, if they're part of creating the future, there is this practice around getting advice if there's a decision to do that, right? So it's like, what are the minimum viable steps for board or governance decision making, and how do those occur? And then if I, as an online participant, know that that's occurring and then other groups are likely to adopt that, then that does give me confidence that those are, that good decision making is happening.
One of the things that's occurring to me as you all are talking about stuff, and especially Vu, you're talking about that specific situation, is the acknowledgement. So in terms of what would board members need to feel, what would they need to have? The acknowledgement that we're stepping into something that we haven't done before, that it's going to feel clunky, that and when it does, we're going to have a conversation. I put a link in the chat box to the statement of our values in action. It's interesting, even in the speaking agreement that we use at Creating the Future, when one of us is going to do a keynote, there's always a conflict resolution part of that, and it says the first step in any conflict resolution is going to be a conversation. Acknowledging that our intent is to work together. There's something I think powerful in acknowledging we're stepping into something that none of us have done before. In terms of what is the quote right way, we're figuring that out together, and we're going to do that by conversation. But I think that there's something there about acknowledging that elephant in the room. That this is new for all of us. It's not as if one of us knows the way and all the rest of us can feel stupid.
There's a lot of assumptions floating around, always. And the only way to address those is to communicate, to talk to people. It's so easy to think, some of what you were describing, it's so easy to take it personal, whatever it is. Personal based on fill in the blank, my gender, my point of origin, my weight, my age, and it may have absolutely zero to do, whatever it is, zero to do with any of those. But we all, we're creatures that are sort of based on how we feel relative to how we interact. And so if we're feeling uncomfortable and we don't know why, I often find that it's very likely you're going to think it's one of those assumptions that you make, that it's about something not good related to you.
And sometimes it comes from a place of good intention, which is what I'm hearing, Vu, and what you were talking about is if it is a man who's like, I know what I was brought up to do, and I know that's not good. It's the exact same conversation we were having before, which is I know what's not working, but I don't know what will work, and this is new territory. And Elizabeth, I can see your brain working. Is it ready? If it's not ready yet, I'm good, but I just want to acknowledge.
No, just both tracking and connecting the pieces. I think that you asked the question in a really concrete way, Hildy, around what do we need to have to make this work? And I go back to the question of if one of the legal requirements is don't mess up, and how so much of the layers of these expectations, and I think expectations and assumptions are really what we're starting to reveal, are based on fear and past bad experiences. And we've just layered up this whole conglomeration of how boards work around those bad experiences and the fear of protecting ourselves from that messing up. And so I know you've had many conversations around your conclusions and observation about don't mess up is one of those, that short list of requirements, and being able to help making it specific to creating the future. What are the decisions that you've seen in the past you need or want to be making? And I like the idea of breaking them down and then figuring out how to your concrete question, Hildy, of like, how do we make that happen? Whose voice? How do we address it? And not as much when things aren't going right, but just knowing we're continuously in conversation that reveals how are we doing. Because if a board is saying something that a part of the community is doing isn't right or isn't working, that's also a power assumption.
Right.
So that I think that structuring that series of questions and the engaged conversation that continuously happens, not when it seems like there's a red flag, but we're always engaged in that discussion, which is your practice.
Right, right.
Yeah, can I build on that? Because I think it seems like well, with all of these issues, we keep coming back to it's about having conversations, whether it be about conversations about our assumptions or conversations about whether things align or not. So conversations are so important, and not just when problems come up, but continuously about good things that are going on, maybe not good things that are going on, having tools to have, especially the difficult conversations. But it also means having then time to have those conversations and having to have them regularly would be important. And I'm sorry that I'm going to have to go in a little bit to have another conversation with my colleagues about our search that we have going on. So I want to say also goodbye while I have this chance.
Any other reflections before you go?
No, just I think I keep coming back to, in a lot of different contexts I have, we get so busy, like at least I do, checking my things off the list of what I have to get done, and really just having always space and time available for when conversations either need to occur or to make sure that they're occurring is something that I'm trying to work on, scheduling conversations into my life better or something. But I think that is so important. Yeah. And so many for anything really. So yeah, we might have to meet as a board more than just once a month, for example.
Well, and I'll tell you the thought that's occurring to me, and of course you're leaving now, and I'm like riffing off of everything you're saying. There is this assumption that a board is an all volunteer or function that really has no staff. And it is occurring to me that this is such a critical function. The meeting of expectations of your community members is like the biggest thing that we can be doing. And that this may be a completely different structure of what supports the board to be able to do this. The board may be the conduit. The board may be the ones doing the ensuring, saying, we're going to assign this to our team, who is the integrity team. I'm making stuff up here, but the integrity team, whose job is, and the board is constantly refining the questions that the team, what are the questions that the team will ask to the people out in the field that the person with the expectations wants to know about.
Right.
In acting as that conduit, we may be looking at a completely different structure.
Yeah.
Just Hildy, on that note, there's a book called Crowdocracy, and the notion is, the idea is like crowdsourcing. The author's proposal is that why don't we just crowdsource public policy, legislation, do away with elected representatives to make decision-making in society generally. And the book articulates, for that to occur, decision-making to be broken down into very specific and a very defined process for what a good decision looks like. But one key role that they articulate in that book is what they call guardians of the process, which is a full-time role, people who steward an integrity process, and just they're facilitators. So they're not intended to influence the decision-making, they just oversee the steps. And so when you just maintaining an integrity board, and what Angie was just, equipping communities of people to have good conversations, that is maybe, more than 2-hour board meeting every month. You know what I mean? It's like a facilitator role that could be a full-time job.
Yeah. And can I also add, as a person who's my field's public administration, I think there also is that facilitator role is important, and there's a role for expertise around certain areas, right? Or having people who can come in and help us understand things. I know a lot of us, we can make a lot of decisions on our own, but sometimes it's also helpful to have people coming in who can bring new perspectives or expertise. I get a little bit worried about crowdsourcing without some I don't know. Anyway, there's more conversation to be had that I can't have right now about this.
Oh, sure. Just start the ball rolling.
You know, I know. Dang. Okay, so next time, hopefully we have more.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. I'm glad you're
Thanks, you guys. Have a good rest of the day. We'll see you later.
here.
Thanks, Angie.
Bye.
Bye, Angie.
Can I go back to something else, Hildy? Just this notion, because it goes back to what Vu was saying around, I really appreciate the story, Vu, about you implemented this practice around, team members getting advice from others who may be impacted and, advice getting, but then a little bit of maybe reticence from team members to step forward and calling you and saying, why are you making the call on these things? We've actually, with some groups, I want to challenge the statement, or I guess question around it, this statement, for boards to not mess up. We've had to unpack that with some groups who have become so fearful to do any decision making. And finally, it was one meeting, and now I've started saying this to a lot of groups, to say fiduciary duty does not mean you have to be right all the time. Because a lot of board members interpret that as like, oh, fiduciary duty means I have to be correct all the time. And so, oh my gosh, I better not blow anything up. Forget that. That's at the other end of the spectrum, right? But it's to say, no, you can mess up, you can make mistakes. You just have to show some degree of diligence, that you gave it some bloody thought, or read some things, or talked to some people. If you can demonstrate some diligence. So I think it's actually okay to mess up, as long as you were able to show that you kind of gave some things some thought, or in this case, creating the future, we had good conversations, right? That we empowered people. We got advice from people who were experts in an area. And if we still messed up, that's okay. But as long as we did those other things, then we'll call it good.
And I need to narrow the focus of the messing up. It's actually, don't do anything illegal.
Right. Fair enough. Yeah.
Seriously, if you're
Yeah.
talking about what boards are legally required to do,
Yeah.
you are required to exist, and you're required to not do anything illegal.
Yeah.
So it's not really don't mess up. It is don't mess up legally. Don't do something illegal. Know what keeps you. Yeah. And and there's not even that many of those.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. What's really, here's what's really sparking for me at this moment. The work just for creating the future, of moving from, we have been in conversation for many years at this point about, it really is, what does integrity look like for this board? We didn't know that's the question that we were asking, but it really came down to what fits, what makes the most sense. And this is a huge thing that we're talking about implementing. And what Angie's conversation sparked for me, and the fact, you all were talking about the fact that this is going to need facilitators of conversation, and I am wondering if even the process of designing the structure is something that needs a staff, whether it's at staff or it needs to be work, not something that we do once a month to figure this out, not something that a group of volunteers gets together once a month and moves it a little bit forward. I think that there's a big, what are the roles and functions and structures that need to be in place? There's a lot of defining, what are the questions that we're going to ask? Who are we going to ask it of? What is the process by which we're going to ask it? I think this is like a full-time job for 6 months to a year for a group to figure out. I don't know if that's making any sense, but things like what are the protocols? What are the mechanisms? Who asks what to whom? How does that happen? Who documents that? We're right now, the documentarian for the board is me. But who summarizes? How does this maintain the openness and high participation that we have always encouraged in terms of everything we do is open and public? There's big chunks of stuff for me that are suddenly going, yeah, okay.
I just really like that, your use of the word protocols. Because even though, going right back to the outset, someone's comment, I think it was Dimitri, we don't want to be I mean, I don't think you can be over prescriptive around here's how decision making is going to occur in every scenario, and here's how we're going to engage. It's going to be different, right? But if we could articulate, have someone figure out those protocols that are aligned with the values, that are aligned with the principles on that page.
I mean, we're
you
going to
just
need
shared.
bylaws.
Yeah.
What the hell are our bylaws going to say?
Yeah.
You know, I think about,
Here, let me switch you over.
amusing sidebar. I think about Apple and not Apple. I mean, I think about Google and their initial "Don't be evil," and how that was sort of a philosophy and it wasn't a protocol. And as a result, they're kind of becoming evil. And so just because you start out with you know, a philosophy, a belief system, a whatever, it has to be incorporated or codified in such a way that it transcends the personalities, it transcends and is able to address the challenges. Because, you know, Google is becoming a big entity, so it is behaving like a big entity. And so, you know, all of their internal processes are based on processes that have been tried, and I'm not going to say true, but tried elsewhere and are being used by other big entities. So anyways, I'm just sort of thinking about what you're saying, Mark, you know, from the perspective of, you know, the importance of the codification of however minimal these rules, philosophies, ideas are, they need to be set up so that they are transcendent to the personalities, the individuals, the problems, the issues, and they're transferable. So this is the whole point of having 10 different organizations that operate differently. If those rules can transcend and transfer, then they can use these too, as opposed to they only apply to us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, oh, sorry, I was just gonna say, I think that's possible, like codifying things, but this still leaves this comfort with ambiguity that's possible for different generative approaches. Like Hildy, when you said bylaws, I immediately thought of one group that they wanted their board to share community or encourage community, their membership to always bring forward proposals. And so they refer to their board as an activation committee. Like, we're not a board, we're an activation committee because we want to activate the ideas from the community, and that's in their bylaws, and they specify the different, you know what I mean? So I think you could, hopefully it's possible.
Well, I have envisioned our bylaws, because bylaws can be whatever they want. That's another thing. There's nothing legal that says what bylaws need to contain.
Totally.
Which is a whole nother piece. And it occurs to me that I've thought for a long time that our bylaws could say, when we have decisions to make, here are the questions we'll ask in the order in which we will ask them, period. And so how will you know how you recruit? And how will you know how many board members you have? Here are the questions we'll ask, and here's the order in which we will ask them.
We can just make it very simple. I don't know. That's another thing we can transform is the whole bylaws thing. It's just a very regimented, liabilities-focused documents. I mean, why can't we make it more hopeful? You know, or we just make it minimally viable. How are we going to recruit them? The board will vote on people. How many board members? 1 to 800. I don't know. We should have, it should just be big, and the range should be large enough that we just do whatever we need to.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, bringing Maria back up to speed. Go Elizabeth, and then, yeah.
Oh, welcome back, Maria. Go ahead, Hillary.
Just want to bring you back. We've been sort of, our brains are hurting. That probably pretty much says it. Our brains are hurting, and we've been sort of talking about the fact that the answer to everything, is going to be conversation and questions. What do the protocols look like? What do the mechanisms look like? And yeah, Elizabeth, you go, because I've got a
well,
big
connecting a couple of the things that we have been talking about, and feeling the tension between the making it simple. I keep going back to your charge to us to do that, Vu, and the very practical questions. And one of the things that I've seen work well is to be able to do it in real time. And so not trying takes necessarily 6 months to lay everything out and say, we'll have an answer in June for what this is, but instead, you know, having that the in-between work is really important. One of the observations I heard you say is this isn't effective by just coming together as volunteers once a month. Right. And we're going to make the progress. It's the in-between work that might be held by staff. And I think that also has been ongoing. So being able to, in practice, apply the big question. So if we're saying the way we're doing our work is to be able to let the people who are most impacted make the decisions, and then a decision arises, and then we practice and say, well, what does that look like? And then we start codifying what ends up working, you know, learning from it, changing it as we go along. And another connection that I heard was around this guardians of the process idea, that the board is a guardian of the process. To the question of crowdfunding decision-making, talk to California about ballot initiatives. We've got a long history and some challenges around how that works. Some really great intention behind it, but it can take us in all kinds of unfortunate directions. But making that connection between the board as guardians of the process and their centerpiece of the values. And this is not surprising for a Creating the Futures conversation, to take us back to the values and be able to say, instead of our definition of what's not going right is that the board's continuously asking if the process and decision-making that are happening throughout the organization are upholding and living the values.
Right.
And that anytime those values, we see something that's happening that's out of alignment with the values, that's our time to be able to start asking a series of questions. And that you have those structures and processes in place already. So that was a connection that I thought that resonated for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I keep, my brain is really, I don't want to say stuck on, but filtering things through this phrase that just keeps coming back to me over and over again, that this is a program. That this isn't a role of the board as much as a program to ensure we're walking our talk and meeting the expectations of the people to whom we've made commitments. And by what it does is we have everything else we do as organizations, but we sort of call programs. It has a goal, it has a purpose, it has a here's how we do it. And then we have the board, which we don't know what to do with. So yeah. And there's a part of me that it shifts the way my brain is working when I stop thinking about it as the board and I start thinking about it as a program to ensure that we are walking our talk with integrity and meeting the expectations of the people who have expectations of us. It's a language shift for me, and it may just be me, but there's something that changes about what we expect, who we expect it of. Yeah, there's something big that I keep, it's a language thing, I don't know.
We might have to lock ourselves in a cabin for a few days, just because I'm not so sure 2 hours on the internet might work. I do think that, yeah, we do need to think about all of this stuff. And really a lot of it is like finding the language and really transforming these concepts around. I'm just amazed by how good people are still ingrained with many of these things. I just brought on a new board member, you know, who's like one of my friends, you know, I'm leaving the RBC. I want someone on here who can help kind of carry this along. And of course, we've been like best friends for a long time. And so this is the only time where he is above me in terms of the board, right? And he was just joking, was when I was visiting, he was like, hey, honey, he was talking to his wife. He's like, this is Vu, you may know him. This is one of my new staff. Of course, you know, we've been friends for long, the three of us. And I'm like, okay, like this is, it's fun for us to joke about this. But unfortunately, the jokes are ingrained in this sort of truth that the board is like the boss of the ED and the staff and so on. And even people who are very progressive in terms of transforming things are still very stuck on it. And, you know, like, I think we have to be able to identify what are some of these things, like the concept of the board being the boss of the staff and the final thing. I don't know. We might have to be able to give people some new concepts, like the board is like the, I don't know, the legislative branch or whatever it is. Even that is still very strict in like sort of this thing, right? So I don't know. So that's, can't see where you're going. It's like, we need to come with a new framework entirely for this board that is not at all. And I'm just kind of thinking about the experiment that they did where people like ask kids to draw a picture of a fish, right? And these 6-year-olds were drawing pictures of a fish. And one group was told, just draw whatever you want, just draw a fish. And then the other group was like, hey, here's some pictures of I want you to draw a picture of a fish. And here's one that, you know, here's an example of what that looks like. And all the kids who had an example of what a fish looked like drew fish that looked remarkably like the example. Whereas the kids who didn't have, they drew all sorts of random things that were very creative. And for us, like, we had to get out of this fish example, this fish archetype of the board archetype. And I don't know how we're going to do that. Like this.
I am so struck by that, Vu. If we stop completely talking about this as a board.
Yes.
Just for however long it takes, this is not the board. This is what will it take to ensure that we are walking our talk with integrity and meeting people's expectations. What does that thing, call it a program, call it whatever you want. What does that look like? What would we do if somebody came to you and said, you have got $70 bazillion, do whatever it takes to walk this talk with integrity and to show that what would we build to do that? And then if you want to call it a board, great. If you want to call it a whatever, great. Or we just have our 3 people that meet once a year and say, oh, yeah, that sounds great.
That's what I'm kind of thinking. It seems like this is part of the work we're doing, is really talking about all this. But I'm also very interested because of all the other stuff that we have to do, and they have to be in integrity with one another, right? Because this is something that we've been thinking about, which is like, we have to get out of this concept of here's a separate thing that's the board, here's a separate thing that is the staff, because that's kind of where we've been getting into trouble. Because I would actually love to think about, you know, like the incrementalism that we have to deal with, the way nonprofits are related to one another, the Hunger Games, the way we do fundraising is extremely problematic, the way that we measure impact. All of these things are simultaneously together, they affect one another. And so I don't want us to really start going down the path way too much of isolating one element to talk about, when we may need to talk about this holistically about the entire sector and what we have to think about. Not just the fish archetype of the board, but the fish archetype of the entire sector is what we got to think about.
So loving that in so many ways. And although expanding it beyond governance or the boards may be valuable, I also, to me, part of the case you're making goes back to what you're saying about keeping things simple. Because I think one of the reasons why people fall back or keep going back to these simple, the board is in charge of the ED, you know, your friend is your boss, there's that hierarchy, a board is accountable for everything, is because they're easily understood. Mm-hmm. So if nothing else, if we can codify or something that is pretty easily be understood, as easy as, now they're not easily implemented, like they're disastrous. Why we get phone calls every week, because it's falling apart at the seams everywhere we look here at Vantage Point, right? It's just not working. But people easily understand the board is on top of the CEO, and they easily understand that board is in charge of everything, right? And I've mentioned this to Hildy, but I love the Ontario Nonprofit Network has started to recognize that need for that reframing. And right at the top of one of their websites, they have this big emblem, board does not equal governance. And they just want to shatter that. The minute you go to that site, they just want that front and center. Board, like, stop thinking that. The board is the governance, they're separate things. Governance is a bunch of people that impact, and then the board is like one thing over here, and they're not the same thing, right? And so but that's like tip of the iceberg of this new fish that you're describing.
Or maybe it's not a fish.
Exactly.
So We have boards because we legally have to.
Yeah.
And we're trying to jam this square peg in a round hole. We're still trying to find something. What the hell are these 3 people going to do? These 10 people going to do? These 1 people going to do?
800.
These 800 people going to do? Yes, yes, that's what our bylaws will say. And I keep coming back to what is the function that actually needs to get done here? And if it makes sense for the board to do that, great. But are we again trying to? Yeah, let's give that to the board. Are we going into that place where instead we want to define a function that absolutely is critical and isn't being done? That the board could be the relayer of, the whatever of, or could just say, that looks great, kids. Keep going. We'll see you next year.
I think you might have been onto something, Hildy, with your notion that this is more of a program. You know what I mean? That may strike this balance between taking a holistic view, like Vu is suggesting, looking at the whole structure of nonprofits. So it's like, it's the program of governance, or it's the program of good decision making. And then, yeah, legally we have to have the board, so the board will have some part of that. But like, what is that part? And where you've leaned so far is it's to steward the values, and that's kind of it.
Yeah.
Right, to hold that, right? So, but if it's not okay, governance is up to the board, or decision. It's not. What is this? What is board decision making? Like, no, saying one of the programs in our organization is decision making. And how does that happen? Or
stewarding the values. I like this. I loved that. I loved that phrasing. That we are so dedicated to walking the talk of our values. And that's huge. I mean, half the reason that consultants get called into anything is because of the disconnect of walk and talk.
The only I'm struggling a bit with the notion of, say, a program when I try and mesh that with the intent of looking at the organization holistically. That it, you know, you think of, when I think of programs, I think kind of a silo here. But again, that's my fish, right? So I acknowledge that my fish might be following some form that's fixed in my head. You know, it's almost like as Mark was talking, I was thinking, well, if not a program, how else? And it's sort of like it feels like a core service, you know, like communications, marketing, you know, it's something that is kind of cuts across differently than a program can get a bit isolated and could kind of do its own thing a little bit.
I like the thought of a core service. The language part that I was having trouble with, Maria, and it's where I started to play with, this is really a program, is that we're, and I hadn't really thought about the core services until you started to talk about it, is that where I keep getting hung up is on the word board. Mm-hmm. And it is the fish. I love that story, Boo. I love that story because that fish is even stuck in my head. And that when I stopped thinking about it as the board and started to think about it as, okay, if this was just a program, what would we do? Well, we'd build these structures and we'd say, this is what we need and this is what it's going to take. But it's the board. We go, oh yeah, well, what are they going to do? I don't know. But a core service, it's the same thing. This is, and what I was thinking as you were talking is how many times you've got, especially in a large organization, you've got, you know, the marketing and communications department, who will constantly say, people keep throwing it to us, which is again the silos thing, when in fact marketing and communications should be infused into everything that everybody is thinking about. Communications needs to be, and the fundraisers will tell you the same thing. We're a core service, but everybody just keeps coming to us rather than fundraising as a part of, well, if you take away those standard roles and you say, this really needs to be infused into everything, thinking about core services in a different way of how do we think about that? Are we thinking about it as, well, that's their job, it's not our job? There's something about structure and language here that I love this fish thing, because it really is the fish that we're drawing.
Go ahead, Elizabeth, and then I will.
Well, just a 2 cents on the language piece. Governance is a word that is so differently or misunderstood. It could be valuable to say that the it is governance, and our governance is leading with integrity, grounded in and aligning with our values. And instead of the program piece also didn't kind of settle for me.
Yeah.
The idea of testing what language to use. And so I was kind of drawn to the idea of governance. And Mark, I'm really curious about exploring more of that disconnect, the board not equal to governance. This can help articulate that. So for what we're describing is governance, and who has roles in governance and which roles are they, and how do we, maybe the board has a lead role in the alignment around values, that TBD, or maybe not. But governance resonated for me around language. Thanks, Maria.
There's just thinking of our aspiration, I guess, to have this group kind of the network kind of impact. Mark will remember this name, and I don't know if anybody else has come across him. It was somebody that worked with us as an advisor and friend, let's say, a guy named David Schreiber, who's based in the US. I think he's still in Washington State right now. He's an entrepreneur, had a toy company called Uncle Skunkle Toys. But he's also has a master's in organizational development and did a lot of thinking about kind of, I found his ideas really mind shifting in terms of how he sees teams and really effective teams in a much more of a spoken hub kind of picture is what I'm imagining. And even his concept of an executive director, for example, or a CEO was not about power and hierarchy. It was about, they were kind of the coordinator of resources, let's call it. Anyway, I would just love to unleash his mind a little bit into this work, and I don't know how, in what way that makes sense or whatever. And I can send Hildy, I can send you some details about him, because he's just a fascinating guy. And I feel like he's put a lot of thought. His master's was around very different concepts of organizational hierarchy and structure. And I feel like there's probably some learning there that's relevant to this conversation.
I'm not even sure that we will have a CEO or executive director. It will make it. I think it will make no sense when we started envisioning. I'll share out with you all the graphic that we've been sharing. One of the things that we struggled with, and then we're very close to time here, so we're going to have to go. But one of the things that we struggled with initially when we started to talk about, okay, we get that this is going to be networked, that decision making will be local where it makes sense to make those decisions among the people that we get. But having looked at other models that are sort of hub and spoke and networked, the question becomes, okay, so what's in the middle? So if this thing is spokes and is what's in the center, and it keeps coming back to the board, it keeps coming back to the CEO, it keeps coming back to people talk about holacracy, and they give the example of Tony Hsieh at Zappos, and the reality is, if Tony Hsieh left tomorrow and the board hired somebody who said, oh, okay, you know what, we're not going to do this anymore, then it wouldn't happen. It would be gone. So what we realized was in the middle was our values. Yeah, okay, but what does that mean in practice? That's a very nice thing to say, but in practice, what does that look like? And started to say, what if what's really in the middle is the answer to why do people need an organization anyway? What they need is they need to be able to find each other, and they need to be able to find resources. And that's because otherwise I'll just go out and feed people. Why do I need, I get the economies of scale, or the scale that I get if I'm with, I need each other, and I need resources to be able to do what I want to do. And so what if that's the thing in the middle? Which means that you don't need a leader, you need a coordinator. Several of you mentioned a coordinator, a facilitator. you need functions, but you don't need a person. You need functions of coordination. You need functions of communication. You need functions of resource. And you know, the thought that we had initially is that what you definitely need a board to do is to make sure we're legal. Is, if nothing else, if that's one of the functions that I need, if I'm just coming up, I'm swimming up and I'm saying, you know, I'd like to do a project that has something to do with creating the future, it'd be nice to know that we're legal. I'd like to do some fundraising. It would be nice to know that we're legal. So those are the knowing that inside there is really what coordinates and supports everybody who's out there doing the stuff that needs to get done. It completely shifts that power dynamic. It moves it from are our employees benefiting the organization to is the organization benefiting the people who are doing the work. And so that shift is what sort of led to we don't know that we'll need a CEO at all. But that whole piece about governance, of course, you know, we're at the point where we're diving into, oh, okay, this makes great sense, and it's time to go. I am going to ask if we will all take a deep, deep breath, because this has been mind stretching. And take a moment, if you've scribbled any notes, circle something that's standing out to you. And let's just take a moment to share what's standing out from this conversation. What questions are bubbling up for you? What are you taking into the rest of your day? What are you not going to be able to stop thinking about?
I'll throw one out there. I mean, there's lots. The metamorphosis, the fish archetype. These will stay with me for a while. And then the other is I was facilitating a session all day Friday and was supporting a group of leaders. We were talking about delegation, physicians talking about delegation. It was quite hilarious. And anyway, I was introduced, I don't know why I've never come across it, I don't know, RACI framework, RACI, I don't know, RACI. Do you say RACI?
I've heard it RACI.
RACI, that's probably correct. The R is who's responsible, A, who's accountable, C, who's to be consulted, or who do you want to consult, and I is who do you need to inform. And I don't know, maybe potentially it'll be relevant at some point or some version of it, because it explores kind of not just the who, but kind of clarifies what kind of role they might play in a way that isn't about hierarchy necessarily.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, Maria, just to jump in there earlier, and it was when you stepped away, just was articulating the different component parts of a decision, and the RASCI framework might be a good way to do that, in terms of where we were going around protocols and codifying to say, okay, a decision has these parts. There's somebody responsible, there's people who have to be informed, and there's people who have, you know, so whether those terms or not, that might be good. And I'll just quickly share. I wrote down like three of the things I wrote down. One is the notion of decision making as a core service. So comparing it to like marketing or communications, I wrote that as a key piece. Equipping people to have comfort sharing power. I just really like that phrase. And then Elizabeth, the way you articulated to say, yeah, maybe we're, you know, stewards of values, and let's articulate those values and then make sure those are present and just monitor the presence of values in decision making, then we can take confidence. Strikes me as that's an approach that groups could adopt in coming up with their own governance approach.
Thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's a lot to think about, whether we are in a metamorphosis or we're blowing things up, maybe both simultaneously. Also, really like the fact that nonprofit boards are not governance, so O&M's work over there is great. I think we have been reading a book over here called Reinventing Organization, and I don't know, many of you probably have read it, but it might be good for us to kind of brush up on some of the same, because even we're talking about advice process, decision making, I'm not sure we're all on the same page. There's a graphic version of it, which is way easier to read. So try that out. And have some discussions around something, because I do think they do try a holistic approach, decision making, hierarchy, all this stuff, communication style, feedback, and it might be good for us to maybe take some of that and think about how do we apply or adapt some of it.
Yeah, wonderful, and it's wonderful having you here.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Elizabeth, how about you?
Yeah, I'm adding that to the list of many resources that I'll follow up on, and I'm really excited and grateful for that. And one of the phrases that stands out in my notes is requiring significant and uncomfortable unlearning, and the importance of that in so much of our work. And I really appreciate the connections for that concept and practice into this work today. So thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Dimitri, I'm going to take mine off so you can turn yours on.
You know, my notes are like jam-packed here. There's so much that we talked about today. A couple of things that boiled to the surface was the fish story, Vu, that you told. And what I was sort of reflecting on is, well, what if we just completely changed the name of stuff? You know, to in essence create a beginner's mind toward whatever it is we're approaching. And so we just pick a word. So instead of governance, it's you know, plantark. You know, we've got to, you know, make sure that we have plenty of that in our organization. Define that. And then we begin to define that so that we don't have those biases, because it's really hard. I mean, you know, I try to think about how do you not walk in with all of these you know, we have mirror neurons, so we mirror other people. I mean, that's part of how we operate. That's our advantage in most cases. In this case, it's kind of a disadvantage that we do that. The other thought that I was kind of is time for conversation. You know, before Angie left, she talked about having time for conversation, and the idea of communication and conversation around these issues came up a whole bunch of different times in this. So I'm kind of left with thinking about all those things sort of combined. You know, we have time for conversation without bias, and if language creates bias by virtue of the words that we're using, then let's, you know, we invent it all anyway, so let's just invent new words that don't carry the baggage with them when we get together.
How about you, Debbie?
You mute up. I scribbled down the phrase, "This is a function, not a board." That what we're really talking about is a critical and absent in most cases function. It may be the most critical. Are we doing what we said we'd do? Are we meeting our commitments? And doing that in an aspirational way, not in a punitive way. There's something really powerful in that, in seeing that as a function, and I am so loving the conversation about I wish I could remember George Lakoff's book, Don't Think of an Elephant. It just kept coming to mind is you know, we just keep coming up with, you say, board, and as much as I'm the one that's constantly blowing stuff up in my head, I still have a concept of, I think we made huge strides today. I need to say, it may feel really muddy, but it really feels like we took a leap. I don't know to what. And generally I can tell when my brain is just fried, because two things happen. My eyes roll up in my head and I do this a lot, and I've been noticing that I just keep like playing with my face. So there's something powerful in here about saying this is a function and not a board. And that if it winds up that our board is 3 people who meet once a year and go, yeah, that's nice, keep going, kids. Then that may be okay if we come up with a function that is, call it governance, call it whatever word you just made up. There's something powerful in acknowledging this is a critical function. and I don't know where that takes us, but I am deeply grateful to all of you for all of the brain bending and being part of this. And we will see you all next month. And Vu, welcome aboard to the crazy train, honey.
Thank you, everyone. I'm looking forward to this. Yeah, give me something to do. It'll be a break from this. So, yeah.
We'll see you soon.
Bye, everyone.
Have a wonderful
Bye.
holiday if I don't see you all.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.